Sarah Mitchell's Tesla Model S purred to a stop 3 blocks from the courthouse, its sleek black exterior gleaming in the morning sun. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, dark eyes studying her deliberately chosen outfit. The worn Howard University sweatshirt and faded jeans felt foreign against her skin, a far cry from her usual Armani suits, but they were perfect for today's purpose. As she walked the extra blocks, her mind drifted to the conversation with her chief of staff the previous evening. "Are you sure about this, Sarah?" Marcus had asked, concern etched on his face. "We could send legal to handle the ticket." She simply smiled, remembering countless similar situations before her success, when she didn't have the option to send someone else. The courthouse loomed ahead, its limestone facade attempting grandeur, but achieving only cold authority. Sarah observed the morning ritual. Lawyers in pressed suits rushing past tired-looking defendants, the metal detectors beeping methodically, and the subtle dance of privilege and poverty playing out in real time. At security, the guard barely glanced at her ID, waving her through with the same dismissive gesture she'd encountered countless times before. His eyes slid past her to the white lawyer behind her, whom he greeted with a respectful "Good morning, sir." Courtroom 4B smelled of lemon cleaner and stale coffee. Sarah chose a seat in the middle row, watching as Judge William Henderson processed cases like a dealer shuffling cards, quick, mechanical, and without much thought. His gavel punctuated each ruling with sharp finality, the sound echoing off walls that had witnessed decades of similar scenes. She studied him as she waited, mid-60s, silver hair perfectly coiffed, reading glasses perched on a nose that seemed perpetually turned upward. His black robe, pristine and pressed, conveyed authority, but it was his eyes that told the real story, cold, calculating, and heavy with assumptions. Case number 47,892, Mitchell Sarah. Parking violation, restricted zone, the clerk announced, her voice carrying the boredom of routine. Sarah rose gracefully, feeling the weight of several curious glances. She'd chosen this particular day after thorough research. Judge Henderson's record showed a pattern of disproportionate fines for minorities, especially in cases he considered teaching moments. As she approached the bench, she noticed the subtle shift in his posture, the slight narrowing of his eyes as they traveled from her sweatshirt to her face. His fingers drummed against his desk. 1, 2, 3 beats of barely concealed impatience. "Ms. Mitchell," he drawled, drawing out her name like a disappointed schoolteacher. "Care to explain why you thought the hospital emergency lane was an appropriate parking spot for your—" He paused, glancing at the citation vehicle. The condescension in his voice was practiced, perfected over years of similar encounters. What he couldn't know was that Sarah had parked there deliberately, after weeks of observing his courtroom and calculating this exact moment. The security cameras were rolling, the courthouse reporter was present, and in precisely 4 minutes, her executive team would arrive with merger documents that would transform this minor traffic court session into something entirely unexpected. Judge Henderson studied Sarah's demeanor with growing irritation. 23 years on the bench had taught him to read defendants like books, but something about this woman's quiet confidence unsettled him. No fidgeting, no nervous glances, no desperate fumbling for excuses, just that steady gaze that seemed to look right through him. "Ms. Mitchell," he began, letting each syllable drip with authority, "do you make a habit of treating emergency zones as your personal parking space?" The question hung in the air, designed to humiliate. Several regular court observers leaned forward, familiar with Henderson's infamous teaching moments. Sarah's response came in a measured tone that carried to every corner of the suddenly silent courtroom. "No, Your Honor, I understand the seriousness of the violation." The absence of excuses or pleading in her voice caused Henderson's left eye to twitch slightly, a tell he'd developed when things deviated from his expected script. The judge lifted the citation, making a show of examining it through his reading glasses. Well, it seems you were parked there for exactly 17 minutes. He glanced at her outfit, at the careful way she held herself. "Tell me, Ms. Mitchell, what was so important that you couldn't find proper parking?" A young public defender in the gallery winced, recognizing the familiar setup. Henderson's reputation for using minor infractions to make examples of certain defendants was well known among the legal community, though never officially challenged. "I was delivering medical supplies to the pediatric ward, Your Honor," Sarah replied, producing a donation receipt with the hospital's letterhead. Henderson barely glanced at it, his jaw tightening at her preparedness. "How convenient," he said, his voice carrying a hint of mockery that caused several spectators to shift uncomfortably. "And I suppose you believe that gives you special privileges, that the rules don't apply to?" He paused deliberately. "People who think they're above the law?" The racial undertone wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. The court reporter's fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second over her stenotype machine, and a law clerk near the bench suddenly became very interested in his shoes. "Given the nature of this violation," Henderson continued, straightening to his full height, "and your obvious lack of respect for emergency services protocols, I'm setting the fine at $5,000. He emphasized the amount, expecting, perhaps hoping for, a reaction of shock or protest. Instead, Sarah's slight smile remained unchanged, as if she'd been expecting exactly this amount. It was that smile that finally cracked Henderson's judicial composure. He leaned forward, his knuckles whitening against the wooden bench. "Perhaps you find this amusing, Ms. Mitchell. Would you care to share the joke with the court?" His voice carried an edge that had made countless defendants cower before him. Sarah reached for her phone with deliberate slowness, her movements graceful and unhurried. "Not at all, Your Honor. I'm simply preparing to pay the fine." The calmness in her voice seemed to fill the room, and for the first time in years, Judge Henderson felt a flicker of uncertainty on his own bench. The courthouse's double doors burst open with military precision. 3 men and 2 women in immaculate suits strode in, their collective presence immediately commanding attention. The lead figure, Marcus Chen, Sarah's chief of staff, carried a leather portfolio bearing the distinctive quantum helix logo of Mitchell Dynamics. Judge Henderson's hand froze mid-gavel as he processed the interruption. "This is a court of law," he began, but his voice lacked its usual thunder. "Your Honor," Marcus announced, his voice carrying the weight of billion-dollar deals. "I apologize for the interruption, but Ms. Mitchell's signature is required immediately on time-sensitive acquisition documents." He approached the bench, each step calculated and purposeful. Sarah's phone screen still displayed the payment app, but now the gallery could see the balance. 8 figures, casual as pocket change. A young lawyer in the 3rd row choked on his coffee as recognition dawned. "Oh my God," he whispered to his colleague, "that's Sarah Mitchell, the Sarah Mitchell." The name rippled through the courtroom like a stone disturbing still water. Judge Henderson's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and the first hints of dawning horror as his clerk frantically passed him a tablet showing the morning's business news. Mitchell Dynamics CEO set to acquire Quantum Solutions in historic $2.8 billion deal. There she was on the screen, the same woman who stood before him, but now in her natural element, sharply tailored Armani suit, commanding the stage at last month's Tech Innovation Summit. The woman who had revolutionized quantum computing, whose net worth made his yearly salary look like a rounding error. "Your Honor," Sarah spoke, her voice unchanged but somehow different now, carrying the same quiet authority that had convinced hardened venture capitalists to bet billions on her vision. "Would you prefer the fine payment in traditional currency, or should I transfer it in quantum-secured cryptocurrency? My company just patented the technology last week." The gallery tittered, and Henderson's gavel hand trembled slightly. The court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keys as she watched the scene unfold with undisguised fascination. Marcus smoothly placed the acquisition documents on the bench. "Ms. Mitchell, we need your signature to proceed with the Quantum Solutions merger. The board is waiting on the conference call, and the European markets close in 20 minutes." The simple jeans and Howard sweatshirt now seemed less like poverty and more like a power move, a deliberate choice by someone who had nothing to prove. Sarah's slight smile hadn't changed, but now it carried the weight of victory rather than resignation. "One moment, Marcus," she said, her fingers moving across her phone screen. I believe I need to settle my court obligations first. The payment confirmation chimed, its cheerful tone echoing in the stunned silence of courtroom 4B. The courthouse security footage hit Twitter at 2:47 p.m. By 3:15, it had gone viral. The high-definition video captured every microaggression, every subtle shift in Judge Henderson's expression. Every moment of barely concealed prejudice played out in crisp digital clarity. "Watch how he doesn't even look at her when she first approaches," commented a prominent civil rights attorney, breaking down the footage frame by frame for her million followers. The video split into multiple segments, each highlighting different aspects of the encounter. Henderson's dismissive tone, his deliberate mispronunciation of Mitchell, the calculated cruelty of the inflated fine. CNN picked up the story by dinner time. Billionaire CEO exposes judicial bias in viral courtroom encounter, scrolled across screens nationwide. The footage played on loop, intercut with clips from Sarah's recent TED talk about breaking barriers in tech. The contrast was stark, the same woman commanding a stage at MIT, then being talked down to like a child in traffic court. Fox News took a different angle. Wealthy tech CEO stages courthouse confrontation. Their analysts debated whether Sarah had orchestrated the entire incident, inadvertently confirming her point about systemic bias by questioning her motives rather than the judge's behavior. Sarah's phone buzzed continuously with interview requests, but she maintained her silence, letting the footage speak for itself. Instead, she retweeted stories from others sharing similar experiences with Judge Henderson. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, revealing a pattern that stretched back decades. "Remember when he fined my grandmother $2,000 for a broken taillight?" wrote one local resident. The tweet gained traction, spawning a hashtag #HendersonJustice. More stories poured in, each one meticulously documented by a team of civil rights lawyers who had been waiting years for exactly this kind of exposure. By nightfall, the courthouse steps had become a gathering place. Hundreds of people stood in silent protest, holding phones displaying the footage. Local news crews captured the scene, a sea of glowing screens, each showing the same damning sequence of events. Inside her penthouse office, Sarah watched the coverage while finalizing the Quantum Solutions merger. Marcus handed her a tablet showing the latest social media analytics. "It's beyond viral," he said. "We're looking at global reach." Sarah nodded, remembering every dismissive glance, every doubtful investor, every door that had tried to close in her face. Schedule a press conference, she decided, but not yet. Let the footage do its work first. On screen, political commentators debated the broader implications. "This isn't just about one judge," argued a legal scholar. "It's about the thousand small moments of prejudice that play out in courtrooms across America every day. The only difference is, this time someone was powerful enough to make us pay attention." Rachel Chen, lead investigative reporter for The Washington Post, stared at her monitor, surrounded by 20 years of Judge Henderson's case files. Her team had been working around the clock since the footage went viral, piecing together a disturbing pattern that went far beyond casual prejudice. "Look at these numbers," she called to her editor. Over the past decade, Henderson's fines for minority defendants averaged 312% higher than those for white defendants with identical violations. The data sprawled across her screens in damning detail: spreadsheets, graphs, thousands of cases showing a clear statistical bias. But it was the private prison connection that made her hand shake. Buried in offshore accounts and shell companies, a clear financial trail linked Henderson to Private Corrections Corporation of America. For every defendant who couldn't pay their inflated fines, the prison company profited. The judge's Caribbean vacation home suddenly made sense. Meanwhile, in Sarah Mitchell's downtown office, her legal team worked methodically through their own investigation. "We've identified 847 cases showing clear racial bias," her lead counsel reported. "The pattern goes back to his first year on the bench." Sarah stood at her floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city below, and the victims. Mostly working-class families, the fines often exceeded monthly incomes. "We've documented 126 cases where defendants lost their homes trying to pay." The lawyer paused. there's more. We found evidence of coordinated action with other judges in neighboring districts. A knock at the door interrupted them. Marcus entered with a USB drive. You need to see this, he said, plugging it into the conference room display. Security footage from other courtrooms filled the screen, showing Henderson in private conversations with other judges, their body language suggesting conspiracy rather than casual discussion. Sarah's phone buzzed. Rachel Chen was requesting an interview, claiming she had uncovered systematic judicial corruption. But Sarah had bigger plans than mere exposure. In a small apartment across town, a former court clerk named James Wilson clutched a shoebox full of documents. After seeing the viral video, he'd finally found the courage to come forward. The papers detailed Henderson's private meetings with prison executives, complete with dates, times, and photographed handshakes. We're looking at a Ricio case, Sarah's legal team concluded. Systematic corruption involving multiple judges, private prisons, and municipal bonds. The evidence mounted hourly as more whistleblowers emerged, encouraged by Sarah's public stance. But Sarah wasn't interested in merely punishing Henderson. Prepare the Reform Initiative documents, she instructed her team. It's time to change the system, not just expose it. Her fingers traced the edge of her desk as she remembered countless others who hadn't had her resources to fight back. The press conference room at the courthouse was packed to capacity. Judge Henderson stood at the podium, his usual commanding presence diminished by the strain of the past week. The carefully scripted statement in his hands trembled slightly under the harsh glare of camera lights. My record speaks for itself, he began, his voice carrying none of its former courtroom authority. 23 years of dedicated service. What about the private prison kickbacks? A reporter from the Tribune cut through his prepared speech. The question sparked an avalanche of others, each more damaging than the last. Henderson's face reddened. I have never shown bias in my courtroom. Ms. Mitchell simply didn't present herself as someone of her position. The moment the words left his mouth, his press secretary winced visibly. Social media erupted instantly. Didn't present herself as someone of her position, began trending within minutes. Political commentators dissected every word, every micro-expression. The clip played in an endless loop on news channels, each replay revealing new layers of ingrained prejudice. Across town, in a pristine television studio, Sarah Mitchell sat across from Anderson Cooper, her composed demeanor a stark contrast to Henderson's unraveling public image. Let's be clear, she said, her words measured and precise. This isn't about me. It's about the thousands who faced similar treatment without the resources to fight back. Judge Henderson didn't see a CEO because he wasn't looking for one. He saw what his biases told him to see. The interview's ratings soared as Sarah methodically detailed her investigation's findings. She presented evidence of systemic discrimination, charts showing dramatic disparities in sentencing, testimony from former court employees, financial records revealing the private prison connections. Back at the courthouse, Henderson's press conference descended into chaos. Are you saying CEOs should dress a certain way? Shouted one reporter. Would you have imposed the same fine on a white woman in casual clothes? Demanded another. That's not, Henderson stuttered, his carefully constructed defense crumbling. There's a proper way to present oneself in court. And what way is that exactly? The question came from James Wilson, the former clerk, now standing at the back of the room. The camera swung toward him as he held up his box of documents. Should they dress to match their bank accounts, Your Honor, or just their skin color? The room erupted. Henderson's press secretary rushed to end the conference, but the damage was done. As they hurried the judge off the stage, his final desperate attempts at justification were caught by hot microphones. She tricked me. She came in looking like. The unfinished sentence spoke volumes. The Mitchell Foundation for Judicial Reform launched on a Wednesday morning, backed by a $50 million initial investment. Sarah stood at the podium in the same Howard University sweatshirt she'd worn to traffic court, now a symbol of calculated resistance. We're not here to destroy careers, she announced to the assembled press corps. We're here to transform them. Behind her, a massive screen displayed the foundation's ambitious initiatives. judicial education programs, community engagement requirements, and a groundbreaking oversight system using AI to detect patterns of bias in court decisions. In his home, Judge Henderson watched the broadcast, his suspension notice lying unopened on his desk. His phone had been ringing nonstop, calls from other judges implicated in the private prison scandal, from reporters seeking comments, from former defendants now filing class action lawsuits. The foundation's first proposal landed on his desk that afternoon, an opportunity to become the program's inaugural participant. "Consider this a chance for redemption," read the note in Sarah's precise handwriting. "Your choice: resign in disgrace, or help us build something better." The program's details were simultaneously brilliant and ruthless. Judges would spend 3 months living in the communities they served, attending mandatory bias training, and participating in a revolutionary court observation program where AI technology would analyze their decision-making patterns in real time. "We're not asking for perfection," Sarah explained to a packed auditorium at Harvard Law School. "We're demanding accountability." The speech was interrupted by 7 standing ovations as she outlined how technology could help eliminate judicial prejudice. Behind the scenes, Marcus coordinated with legal teams across the country, preparing to roll out the program nationwide. "We've already had inquiries from 12 state Supreme Courts," he reported. "They're calling it the Mitchell Standard." Judge Henderson sat in his study late that night, the foundation's proposal illuminated by his desk lamp. His career was effectively over. The evidence of his bias was too overwhelming to deny. But Sarah had offered him something unexpected, a chance to be part of the solution. His hand trembled as he reached for his phone. The foundation's number was on speed dial, waiting for his decision. Outside his window, protesters still gathered nightly, their phone screens displaying the courtroom footage that had changed everything. One call would determine whether he'd be remembered as the villain of the story or part of its redemption. The choice was his. 1 year later, the Judicial Training Center buzzed with anticipation. Judge William Henderson approached the podium, no longer wearing his judicial robes but a simple suit. The audience, a mix of judges, law students, and community activists, watched with measured skepticism. "I spent 23 years believing I dispensed justice," he began, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "What I actually dispensed was my own prejudice, wrapped in the false authority of law." The admission hung heavy in the air. In the front row, Sarah Mitchell sat between 2 community leaders from the neighborhood she deliberately parked in that fateful day. The Mitchell Standard had been implemented in 17 states, with data showing a 47% reduction in discriminatory sentencing patterns. Henderson gestured to the large screen behind him, displaying real-time bias analysis of court decisions across the country. "This technology doesn't just detect prejudice, it prevents it. Every decision I make now comes with immediate feedback, showing me my own blind spots before they become someone else's burden." The presentation shifted to statistics. 3,000 judges trained, 15,000 cases reviewed, and millions in unjust fines returned to communities. But it was the personal stories that captured the audience. Henderson shared how living in the communities he'd once judged had transformed his understanding. "Last month," he continued, "I returned to my old courtroom, not as a judge, but as an observer. I watched my replacement, a young woman who grew up in the same neighborhoods I once penalized, dispense actual justice. The difference was," his voice cracked slightly, "humbling." Sarah's phone lit up with messages from her team. 3 more states had just adopted the Mitchell Standard. The Supreme Court was considering making it a federal requirement. What had started as a moment of prejudice had evolved into a revolution in judicial accountability. As Henderson concluded his speech, he turned directly to Sarah. "You could have destroyed me," he acknowledged. "Instead, you forced me to confront my own humanity and everyone else's." The Foundation's latest initiative appeared on the screen, a nationwide network of community-based courts, where judges would be required to live within the jurisdictions they served. The old system of judicial isolation was ending. "The fine you imposed that day," Sarah finally spoke, standing to address Henderson and the crowd, "was $5,000. The cost of transforming our justice system? Priceless." The audience rose in a standing ovation, but Sarah's attention was on her phone's latest notification. Another judge, somewhere in America, had just been flagged by the system for biased sentencing. The work continued.